greenhouse economics.
Greenhouse think tank.
Think tank, that's right.
So I'm a Green councillor in Surrey and I'm a member of Greenhouse think tank, and I'm going to give a little bit of a perspective of what's going on in Surrey and what we've been looking at in terms of research. We've been focusing on what we call climate emergency economics. So rather than just declaring a climate emergency locally, what does it mean for the actual economy at a national level? So I've called this presentation Greenwashing Growth, but you could just shorten that to green growth if you like. So I think we need some honesty about what we mean by a climate emergency, that we really need a different politics and economics if we're going to bring that about. What's currently happening is those in the mainstream economic area are using phrases like inclusive growth, better growth, natural capitalism and green growth to really tag climate on to perpetuating economic growth, perpetuating a growth in the scale of the economy and the scale of its energy, material, its overall resource consumption. The alternative is to accept that to get within environmental limits we need to use less energy and less resources in ways that better share those resources so we have decent quality of life for all. But that's not what's proposed with effectively a bolting climate on to business as usual approach. If you're not following her online, I'd urge you to look at what Daniela Gabor is saying on her Twitter feed and in newspapers. What she basically says is climate finance is not going to be the way we can ultimately decarbonise our economies. What we need is a big public sector-led approach. The private sector wants to control the green agenda, control the green transition, and as we've already heard, wants to attract and secure the investment for its own purposes, rather than that which will deliver the climate and social justice outcomes we're looking for. So I'm going to focus the rest of this presentation really on three areas. I'm touching on greenwashing aviation. I'm focusing currently in a campaign against another runway at Gatwick Airport. How greenwash is centralised in our planning system. So I don't think it's just corporate lobbying. What's happened is governments around the world, including the UK, have institutionalised that lobbying, and that greenwash has become the basis of how we do politics and economics. It's intrinsically embedded in the economic system globally, and it's intrinsically embedded in the governance of that at national level. And then finally, I want to talk briefly about how we are subject to a greenwashing of our agenda, that the mainstream continually tries to greenwash how we present the green alternative, how we present a zero carbon future. So we've heard a bit about hydrogen. This is the World Economic Forum, Radio Davos, flying without emissions, how hydrogen is greening aviation. But I was scanning on a couple of phrases in that article. Firstly, it's talking about a 20-seater plane. So there you go, there's a bit of greenwash there. You know, most planes are bigger than that. And then finally, it talks about the company's mission to develop. So this is something that's going to happen at some point in the future. It's not something that's real, that could be implemented now. But this is what BP says about use of hydrogen in aviation. Aviation is one of the hardest industries to reduce carbon emissions, and that's because all but the smallest aircraft still need liquid fuel. So hydrogen is not just a false economy, it's effectively a mirage. And it hides a bigger mirage in aviation, which is called sustainable aviation fuel, which is a rebranding of biofuel. And I'd be love to know where the phrase sustainable aviation fuel comes from. If anyone does know, it'd be really maybe interesting to touch on that when we come to the break. So this is another article. This is from BP's website. They talk about one flight using sustainable aviation fuel across the Atlantic. So the first thing I thought was, okay, well, so how many flights are there each day? You know, how many of the flights on this particular day where this happened were powered by sustainable aviation fuel? Well, I found it was 1 in 100,000. So there are approaching 40 million flights a year. So, you know, this is a tiny, drop in the ocean. So the problem we have is scaling these technologies up. And quite often what's presented is, look, there's a technical solution, but does it work at scale? Does it work at scale economically? Is it cheaper? If it's not, then sustainable aviation fuel for all aircraft would mean that fuel would be much more expensive, which would curtail demand, which would reduce flights, so you wouldn't need to expand any airports. So I think it's not really being posited as a solution that's ever going to happen. It's always being presented as something that could happen at some point in the future, which provides a cloak against business as usual being able to continue. So who is behind sustainable aviation fuels? Lots of marketing, lots of images. So BP, Fueling a Sustainable Future. That's one of the organisations that's behind it. But is there more than that? Well, let's just step back. If we're serious about climate change, let's look at what we're doing internationally to govern the control of climate change. International climate agreements. We know that we talked about limiting our emissions globally to 1.5 degrees. We know we've just now had a whole year where we've exceeded 1.5 degrees, so clearly that process is not succeeding. But you may not know, you might know, that agreement completely excludes all emissions from international aviation and shipping. Responsibility for that has been gifted to two organisations, the International Maritime Organisation and the International Civil Aviation Organisation, ICAO. ICAO's got a committee on aviation environmental protection. The UNFCCC has observer status on that committee. So you can see we have an international agreement, we devolve responsibility to some industry lobbyists, and then the international agreement governing body just can watch and see what happens, and not a lot does happen. ICAO have been meeting on emission reductions since 2004. They've got a membership of lots of countries. Their observer organisations which go to all those meetings include the Advanced Biofuel Association, the Airports Council, the Airport Navigation Council, Organisation for Business Aviation, Aerospace Industries Making Aircraft, Coalition for Sustainable Aircraft, and on and on. And the UNFCCC, the climate body, is just one of those organisations. So you can see that what we've got is a situation where, rather than just corporate lobbying, corporates have been embedded in the governance process of how emissions are going to be reduced in aviation, which is completely excluded from the international process. How does that look in the UK? In the UK we have a thing called Jet Zero. I just imagine a couple of Conservative ministers sitting in a pub and trying to work out what rhymes with net zero. Or I'm just envisaging what Jet Nero might look like, sort of an ambassadorial, sort of emperor figure that's going to rule over the world with a burning torch of the planet in one hand and brandishing a weapon which looks a bit like an aeroplane in the other. Campaigners use pigs as analogies, I think, flying pigs. But the problem is this isn't a joke. This is the current way in which industry has framed the way in which the UK will limit its carbon emissions across the whole of the aviation industry, building on the international work of ICAO work. So who's behind Jet Zero? Well, the UK has a Jet Zero Council. It has lots of ministers, Heathrow Airport, Rolls-Royce, EasyJet, Airlines, Airbus, Shell, Aerospace Industries, Manchester Airports Group. They're all part of the group that governs the UK's Jet Zero strategy, which is the way the UK government sets its sights on how it's going to supposedly reduce, or let's be honest, continue to increase emissions in aviation. And then what happens when we do the thing which allows this to happen in reality? So what happens in reality is we have a set of existing airports, and to realise this ambition of Jet Zero, which is to grow emissions, rely on the future joke of hydrogen fuel that doesn't really apply to aviation in any great extent anyway, or electric planes. I can't imagine an electric jumbo jet getting very far. So it's really about sustainable aviation fuels, which is a rebranding of biofuels, which has, again, huge colonial consequences if we import it, and huge land use farming consequences if we apply to the UK. So that is being justified strategically. What's happening in reality in terms of jobs is aviation industry is automating. the economic benefits only go to senior management, and at best, growth just sustains the economic status quo. So each airport says we'll create so many jobs, and they don't tell you that each year the number of jobs in the sector is reducing. This is a technology-intensive, not jobs-intensive sector. So what happens when an airport comes to expand? Well, in Luton, Luton Airport proposed a green controlled growth framework to drive their expansion. Just a small print in that article there. So they're saying, what you can do is we can grow aviation, but we'll make sure that as we grow, we'll limit our carbon emission growth to that in the government's Jet Zero strategy. As you can see, there's a bit of machinations going on there. Well, I'm campaigning at Gatwick against Gatwick expansion. Gatwick don't have a green controlled growth strategy, they just want growth. So the councils, of which I'm a member of Surrey County Council in Surrey, are challenging Gatwick's expansion plans, saying that instead of their unconstrained growth, Gatwick should have a green controlled growth framework as adopted in the expansion of Luton Airport, and that would make the expansion of Gatwick acceptable from an environmental point of view. For all of the councils in the 10 council areas around Gatwick are adopting that lobbying position. Okay, well, airports, you think airports are, what about eco-homes? Are they good? What about planning of other things apart from airports in the UK? Well, I'm just going to mention briefly oil wells. But before that, I just want you to take a focus of this remarkable creation of the current government, which is the National Planning Policy Framework. What this does is it sets out how the government overall across the whole of the UK wants to achieve sustainable developments through the planning and delivery of new housing, new infrastructure, new buildings across the UK. It has in the heart of it a presumption in favour of sustainable development, which sounds really good, right at the start in paragraph 10. Towards the end, it says, well, basically, what we mean by sustainable development is everything except the extraction of coal in open cast coal mines. So that leaves the gambit of what sustainable development means as being quite wide. The ministerial forward in the original version describes sustainable development being about positive growth, and development that is sustainable is development that goes ahead without delay. So, so what happens then when 5 miles down the road from where I live, someone proposes to drill for oil? My recent, now retired councillor decides that we need to challenge Surrey County Council's decision to allow oil to be extracted at Horse Hill. We launch a challenge to the High Court. That then gets a challenge to the Appeal Court, and finally, last summer we took that challenge to the Supreme Court. The reason we took it to the Supreme Court was on the basis that environmental impact assessments should consider downstream carbon emissions as part of the impact of a planning decision. The way the lawyer put it was that if you extract oil, it's pretty inevitable that you're going to burn some or most of it. And the defence by the council or the government, you could call this a huge greenwashing, had the distinctions of an aura of unreality about them, was the way it was described. So the way in which sustainability is defined in our central planning system for all development for the whole of the UK, when it comes to climate change, has an aura of unreality about it. And my ex-council colleague Sarah Finch put it like this: planning authorities say they don't need to consider the climate impacts of the actual burning of oil, just the impacts of the climate emissions of drilling for the oil. It's like saying a chocolate cake is low calorie as long as you don't actually eat it. Surrey County Council said the planning application was determined in accordance with the National Planning Policy Framework, blah, blah, blah. So I think greenwashing isn't just about corporate lobbying. The corporates have now infiltrated, and they have for many, many, many years, perhaps centuries, governments in the Western world from colonial era onwards, and very much today. And greenwash is embedded in our political system, in how we govern the economics. And to really be serious about delivering climate and social justice together, we need to somehow challenge that. Okay, so let's go zero carbon then. No, we need to envision what the alternative to all that looks like. So what does greenwashing of zero carbon look like? That's my picture of what it might look like. If we talk about recycling, if we talk about eco-homes, if we talk about electric cars, and we talk about ultra-processed vegan food, for me, all of that is greenwashing. Why? Why would I say that? Why is electric vehicles greenwashing? Well, I would pitch that if you really want to do zero carbon, you need to do reduction and reuse before you recycle. You need to reduce energy and retrofit before you bang on about renewables. You need to go local. You need to have place-based planning. You need to have local shops. Invigorate our neighbourhoods. Make sure people can live and work in the same place so that we can walk and cycle. And then switch to buses as well as use trains more and better before we then rely on electric vehicles. On the food, we need to do local food, which means seasonal food, and change what we eat as the year goes round before we consider organic, which might come from far away, or animal friendly, or even fair trade for the stuff that can't be done in all those ways. And that means that we need to look at an economy which is local jobs and people led, and it's bioregional in nature, rather than being technology led, which is where we started off. And that means our economy is going to be more local as much as it can, more regional as much as it can, before we focus on the national economy as being the big deal, serving a global economy rather than actually serving where people live, what their livelihoods in different places are across the UK. But what does greenwashing of that look like? Well, I think we basically greenwash half of it out. And we're left with a bit on the right-hand side. We're left with recycling, some renewables, mainly in new homes. Cycling a little bit, we like to talk about cycling, but EVs, but we still talk about flying. We're not prepared to stop that growing. On the food side, we tend to talk about fair trade and ditch the rest. In terms of the strategies economically, we tend to focus on the technologies rather than the jobs. And in terms of the impact on the economy, but we focus on what's happening nationally and globally, which is going to benefit the big businesses, rather than the small startups, the enterprises, which really are the quickest way to transform and deliver change. And when we greenwash that out, what we do is we hide away the potential, and this is a fairly rubbish slide, the potential of all the jobs you can create, which are local jobs, doing the things which we've just greenwashed out. So we greenwash out the impacts of reuse enterprises, of longer life products, of remanufacturing, of retrofitting homes, which are then masses of jobs in the UK to do, of repurposing buildings, of place-based planning, community renewables, bus drivers, train drivers, community transport, local shops, shorter supply chains, all of those kind of things. But you'll see there's a mixture on there. There's a mixture of jobs and reducing demand. So what we need to do is create the jobs for local sustainable economy, but at the same time accept that our overall amount of energy and material use will go down. So those jobs will be less material intensive. They will be about creating embodied workmanship with existing materials rather than allowing extraction of more materials and more energy to be used. And the challenge we have quite often is we focus on the jobs of the stuff we want to create that's new, like the extra bus drivers, without talking at the same time about the need to reduce the distance which we travel. So at the end, my last slide, is we have a basic political and economic choice. We can try to decarbonise as a private sector-led, tech and infrastructure-led set of projects which are really exciting and really glamorous and are all new and big, supported by finance, private finance as well as public finance, because we don't see we have enough public finance to do it. But that doesn't reduce energy intensity. It increases the scale of our consumption of materials. It doesn't work. So we use environmental social governance. We talk about corporate social governance as a cover-up of the shortcomings. We do greenwash, and greenwash isn't just done by corporates, it's done by governance and governments themselves. The alternative is we need to focus on reducing demand for materials and energy. Unless we do that, unless we deal with this as unless we deal with what goes into the pipe of the problem, rather than just look at the climate pollution at the end, we're not really dealing with the whole problem. This is a system problem. It needs system change. And that system change means that we need to start by transforming the economy at a big level and our demand and the jobs which we employ people to do locally. That means we need to de-link the investments that come from corporates and rich people from politics and transform governance, accept the climate emergency in a way that allows the economic system to deliver this change. I mean, I think there's one thing which we might talk about, I pitched as a question in the jobs. There's a big discussion at the moment about the general election, about how much public finance we can really invest in a green transition. And for me, there's two questions there. If the green transition is the technology-led green transition that the hydrogen industry wants, then the amount will be massive. If the green transition is about reducing our demand and transforming livelihoods, we might not need to do as much, because if we need less energy, the amount of renewable energy we need to provide is going to be less, which means the speed in which we can do it will take less time, which means we can get to zero carbon quicker. But you know, we might need less money. But the challenge quite often is framed as, well, this is the debt we have globally. You know, this is how much money we can spend as a country. This is how much you can take out of your piggy bank, and therefore this is the limit of how much you can act on climate change. I think we need to reframe our economic system and reframe the way we think about economics. Otherwise, we'll be forever trapped by the first pit, which is the mainstream view, and at best, you know, delivery on climate change, delivering in a way that increases equality rather than deepens inequality, will be but a sideshow. Thank you.